Hello, BookTube. Well, it's the start of July, and that means the start of a new BookTube event. The inaugural BookTube event for 2023, BookTube at War. The idea of which came from a viewer, DDB, a viewer of BookTube channels. One of the only examples I can think of where a viewer came up with the idea for an event. But DDB floated the idea, and a whole bunch of people jumped at it. It's a great idea. And that is to read military stuff. Fiction, nonfiction, memoirs, all that sort of stuff, all throughout the month of July. I had an involuntary prep for it in June because I reread the Iliad every year in June. But in July, I plan on bouncing all over the place, much as I do for the other BookTube events that have been happening this summer. I did do it for Book Trek. I did it for June on the Range. Now I'm going to do it for BookTube at War. I have a custom-made thumbnail that I'm deeply in love with. And so when you see that thumbnail, you will know that I am discussing something for BookTube at War. I don't know if I'll do it every day. I might. I'm incorrigible in that way. But I want to talk to you a little about the book that I read last night for the first day of BookTube at War. And it's something that I just got. I just got a copy at the Brattle Bookshop. It's this. You see that whole thing? It's Margaret Leach's book, Reveille in Washington, in this old Time Life Incorporated paperback, which I was wondering, would this be strong enough to withstand a read? I've read this a couple of times, but this is the format I usually see it in, and these Time Life books are not good for sustained use. They really aren't. There's no way to reinforce them, and they tend to fall apart. They were cheaply made. And that's a shame, because they're also attractively made. It would be really nice if some enterprising publisher managed to leap all of the copyright hurdles and reproduce these books in good bindings with the original artwork for all of them. That would be wonderful. What a lineup that would be. There was hardly a dud in the whole bunch of these Time Life books. And when I got, I don't know how many copies of this I've owned, but they're always in this format. And when I got a copy of this yesterday at the Brattle, I wondered, when I get around to reading it, how will it stand up to punishment? And I didn't know that I was going to reread it last night, but I did, and it didn't stand up to punishment. It broke, and it broke a couple of times. Even at the end, it was cracking. So I got a read out of it. I will throw this away. There's no point in putting this in a little free library. This cannot be salvaged. And I will just wait to find another copy of Reveille in Washington, I guess. But boy, oh boy, reading this again, I was struck all over again by how great this thing is. Now, that has been known from the very beginning. This won the Pulitzer Prize for history. I believe Margaret Leach was the first female historian to win the Pulitzer. She also won a Pulitzer. She didn't just win the Pulitzer. She won a Pulitzer. She won the hand in marriage of a Pulitzer. But I always forget with this book or with her book about President McKinley, I always forget how beautiful a writer she is, how amazingly sweeping these things feel. This is narrative history as it's just almost not at all written anymore. And this is the story of Washington, D.C. during the American Civil War. So this does not, digress with the clockwork regularity of other Civil War books into a rehash of Antietam or a rehash of Fredericksburg or anything like that. It doesn't do anything like that. It sticks to Washington, D.C., the nation's capital of a nation ripped apart by civil war. And keep in mind, the Civil War is between the North and the South, and Washington, D.C. is a southern city. It was genius for her to realize that there was such a great story involved here. It's not just the story of that southern location, which meant that every Union general, in addition to thinking about everything else, and if you've got Robert E. Lee to think about, you've got a lot to think about anyway, had to think about, where am I moving relative to my southern city capital that is relatively undefended? Where am I moving relative to that? I don't want to leave anybody with a path for a mad dash straight to the capital. Even if they can't manage to hold it, that will be a moral victory, the like of which there is no other. So all the Union generals had to think about that, and all the Confederate generals had to think about it too. They were always thinking about that. There were always sorties and threatened attacks on Washington, D.C., a city that was full of civilians, as cities tend to be. It was full of civilians who, they might have been there for graft on the government teat, but they weren't expecting to be in a wartime in a war zone. I don't think any of them were. Those dynamics are fascinating, and Margaret Leach does a great job of bringing them out. A fantastic job. Of course, Washington, D.C., being the capital of the Union, but also being a southern city, became a hotbed of sedition and spying and intelligence networks, and that was all caught up with pro-Union or pro-Confederacy, pro-freedom or pro-slave newspapers and agitators all throughout the city, and she keeps tabs on dozens and dozens of these people. It's miraculous. It's a miraculous job. And this is also where a lot of the key players are. This is where General McClellan, for instance, spent far too much of his time. This is where all of Lincoln's cabinet was. This is where all of the leaders of the Confederacy came to swear their oath to the Union that they betrayed, and where some of them served in the Senate. And the city was also home to a vast amount of black people, either slaves or freed slaves in the city or fugitives from the South. It's a fantastic tapestry on which to paint a popular history. I always forget how good this is. I want to read you a couple of bits from it, just to underscore what was going on. Margaret Leach always keeps an eye out. She always keeps one narrative thumb on the pulse of that black population in the city, slaves and free. And here, when I was reading that strand that runs throughout this book, I was extra grateful for the crowd that I have fallen in with on BookTube. I'm extra grateful. I'm grateful for you people anyway, but I'm extra grateful that when we talk about books, we can dispense with the stupid performative garbage that chokes up so much book conversation everywhere, especially in academia, which is completely lost, but also in large parts of the book conversation world, which isn't that big to begin with, ought to know better. Here in this little neighborhood, we get to just talk about books' strengths and weaknesses. If an author is egregiously offensive, we get to talk about that too. And mostly we spend our time talking about what we like and we don't like, and there's no shame. That is wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. And it's important when you're reading this book because this was written 60, 70 years ago. So this was written before the Civil Rights Movement and before all the agitation of the Civil Rights Movement. It was written before, of course, the censorious 21st century. And usages have changed. I've gone on this channel about how one of those uses is just simple fascism. It's just do what I'm going to make an arbitrary, capricious change to usage, and you're going to follow it, because if you don't, I will threaten you. You won't get tenure, you won't get a publishing job, maybe your house will be bombed. I'm going to make this change out of nowhere. Not quite as bad as changing homeless to unhoused, but the change I'm talking about, of course, is that we don't call people slaves anymore. We call them enslaved people. And I'm sure that blue-haired activists on Twitter would justify that. There isn't any justification. First of all, let's be clear about that. It's just fascism. I'm going to make a capricious, at-whim change, and I want you to obey me. So I'm not even going to trouble to give you a good reason why. But I'm sure that if you asked one of these ideological liars, they would say that slave is a dehumanizing term, and that we use enslaved person to remind us that slaves were people, which is based on what? Racism. It's based on racism. It is based on the assumption that if you don't make a white person say enslaved person, they won't remember that slaves were people. Because you know how white people are. So not only does, of course, Margaret Leach not do any nonsense like enslaved person, but also she uses other terms that have fallen out of usage completely. Negro, for instance, has fallen out of usage completely. It's all through this book. She uses it interchangeably with black. And also, even a little bit more skin prickly for you if you're reading this, in the 23rd century, you've never read it before. Forever and ever and ever, a term for a little baby or a little child, black person, was a pickaninny. Now, Negro, it's fallen out of usage, but it was used as much by abolitionists who were willing to die to free slaves as it was by enslavers who were willing to die to keep slaves. So it never really degenerated into a pejorative. And of course, slave has always been just a denominative word. It has never been anything one way or the other. But pickaninny has often degenerated into a slur. You couldn't say it now, and it's right that you couldn't say it now. It's in this book. So you just have to read past it. Margaret Leach didn't have a racist bone in her body. Unless you are a blue checkmark activist on Twitter, in which case you'll say all the bones in her body are racist, just like all the bones in my body are racist. I don't agree with that. I don't know many normal people who do. She didn't mean it as a term of offense or derision. And it's obvious to tell in this book that she didn't mean it that way, but you are going to encounter it. And there's another aspect of her narration of that aspect of the book, of slaves and former slaves are never far from the narrative here. Washington was the center point of that. It was from Washington that the decree for their liberation was emanated. And there's an aspect of that subject that gets a little bit discomforting, probably in a good way. A lot of the ex-slaves who crowded the streets and shantytowns of Washington during the period of this book had no education whatsoever. They were fairly direct, fairly simple in their emotional responses to things. They had lots of friends and relatives who were still slaves, still across the border in southern states. They knew, on some level, what this war might be being fought for. And there was a tendency in the reportage and the commentary of the time to refer to them, that body of black people, collectively and somewhat condescendingly. I think probably because for every one Frederick Douglass, who was more eloquent than anyone in the country, there were 10,000 blacks who had had no education whatsoever, and therefore were, on one level anyway, a little bit on the simplistic side. That element runs throughout this book as well. It's going to read very paternalistic, and it wasn't intended that way. So I know that I'm speaking to the choir here. I'm preaching to the church because you already do this. All of you already do this. For Pete's sake, we're gearing up for Garb August. Garb August as a BookTube event would not be possible if there weren't a large group of readers here who read correctly, who don't read with their, ready to take offense at things that weren't intended to be offensive. But nevertheless, that is an element throughout here, and you get that in passages about, for instance, the reactions of those slaves and former slaves to Abraham Lincoln. The great emancipator is what he used to be called. We have a passage like this. For these were primitive and childlike people. See what I mean? Adrift without a plan for the dependence of slavery. They understood nothing of the political complexities in which their destinies were involved. I don't know that that's true. I think they understood quite well, But anyway, they took no account of the abolitionists who pressed the president to his reluctant decision. They knew only that Lincoln was a man raised up by God to work the miracle of their deliverance. We have thousands of first-hand accounts to prove that this is true. That is how lots and lots of people thought. Their simple imagination had its own power. So we've got primitive, childlike, and simple. So you see, you're going to have to put up with a little bit of that here. You get that in all the historians of the time. And there is a sense in which it's true, but I think you'll know what I mean. There are parts of this book that can't help but make you a little bit uncomfortable. They and other millions like them, flocking to the Union armies of the West and South, or waiting on the plantations of their masters, impressed their faith on a nation's mind. The abolitionists of Congress, Wade, Stevens, Chandler, Wilson, Lovejoy, even the lofty Sumner, have been all but forgotten by their countrymen. The Lincoln who lives in the American legend was shaped in the slave's long dream of a kindly master who should set his people free. So I thought I would open with the most uncomfortable element of this thing, which is definitely. That phrasing would not have come to Margaret Leach on her own. She was reading accounts from the time. It wasn't white people who coined that term for Abraham Lincoln and Massa Lincoln. It was black people. It was slaves and former slaves who realized that, who put on, as she puts it, they put on him the burden of their freedom. Instead of all the agitators who were way ahead of him on the subject, he was reluctant right to the end, right till his pen was writing his signature. He was, on the Emancipation Proclamation, he was reluctant right up until the end. Whereas abolitionists have been saying for 200 years, no, this has to go. Root and branch, it has to go. It can't be a compromise. You can't send them to a colony somewhere else. You can't buy it. You can't do anything like that. This is absolutely fundamental. So that element is not missing from this book. It's very prominent. Also, another element that's prominent in this book and gets more prominent as the war goes on is that Washington stops being a strictly civilian place. It's behind the lines of the front lines of the Union generals, and it's where the wounded go. A lot of the wounded went to hulk ships at anchor or warehouses, various places, horrific places, horrific. But a lot of the wounded were sent back behind the lines to Washington, where there were, at least theoretically, the resources to help some of them, but those resources were swamped. One battle, like Bull Run, would swamp those resources, and all the resources around them, all the local resources. And we get a great passage, a little passage about that here. Late in May, all judged able to endure the journey had been sent to Washington hospitals. Those who remained behind were the men with amputations or breast and belly wounds. As Grant advanced south, his base was moved from Belle Plaine. Fredericksburg was to be abandoned to the guerrillas, and it became necessary to evacuate all the wounded. It was then that Washington received boatloads that surpassed in multiplied dreadfulness all suffering, all that had gone before. Crowds gathered at the 6th Street wharf to meet the steamers. Even the gangways were lined with people. Women wept aloud as the litters passed. 2 by 2, bearers went through the streets, carrying men too far gone to be placed in the ambulances. The death rate in the hospitals began a fearful ascent. So the innocence of Washington goes away as the book progresses. And Leach is very, very good about describing that change, because that change was the harbinger of a different change, as she sees. And she hints at it all throughout the book, but she only really gets to the big gong-sounding notes at the end. And that is that Washington itself changes as a result of being so close to the front lines of an internal war. Of course, we get a lot of other details before we get to that summary, because one other thing happened in Washington. It wasn't just the slaves and the ex-slaves, and it wasn't just the wounded. It wasn't McClellan parading his armies in front of well-dressed socialites. It was also the assassination of President Lincoln at Ford's Theater, which Leach wants very much to remind her readers was part of a concerted effort. Other people were wounded and almost killed that night by the Confederates of John Wilkes Booth, who shot Lincoln in Ford's Theater and then leapt off the balcony onto the stage and fled the theater. And Leach points out something that every time, well, the first time I read her book was, I don't want to tell you how long ago it was, but the first time I read her book, I was stunned by her reminder that the reason that the actors in the troupe playing the play that Lincoln was looking at, My American Cousin, the reason they were able to so confidently identify the assassin to the police and to government agents and the military is because he was a famous actor. They all knew him. A lot of them had worked with him. There was no doubt in their mind. They saw John Wilkes Booth jump down onto the stage. He was a famous face anyway, but they, more than anyone, knew who he was. And Leach spends a lot of time on that loose, crazy conspiracy of people in the Capitol to hatch these various attacks that led people in the streets to wonder and spread the rumor that Lincoln's entire cabinet had been killed. And it was a crushing one, too, because first, as the night went on and then the dawn came up, people started to realize that, no, those rumors weren't true. We've been seeing members of the cabinet rushing from building to building. One member was stabbed in his home. But no, those rumors weren't true. Oh, thank God. And then the crushing 1-2 blow, because you get that moment of hope, and then you realize that the rumors were true for President Lincoln himself. That's all wonderfully done in this book, just wonderfully, feelingly done. And as a result, Washington, and by extension the country, changes. I want to read you that passage. just to wrap up, just a gush about this book. I debated whether or not to start with Reveille in Washington, since I've read it a couple of times before, but I wanted to start BookTube at War off on a strong note, on a thing I know I like, rather than risk, having a bad omen or anything superstitious like that. But I want to read you just a bit here to close this out. The old jog trot would not come again to Washington. It had vanished forever with the pleasant provincial city, the grinning slaves, and the broad-brimmed hats of the planter politicians. Not in the bustle of Yankee efficiency had war left its supreme mark on Washington, not in the tumbling contraband huts or the wreckage of men in the big white hospitals, but in the great centralization of federal authority, which had transformed a country town reserved for the business of government into the axis of the Union. The capital of a reconstructed country would not yield an unblemished page for the history books. In days to come, a moral man would find more cause for sadness there than in the tragic streets of Richmond. But, north and south, there was a strength in this conglomerate people, at once willful and steadfast. With the tenacity which had carried it through 4 years of internal war, the country would survive the bitterness of peace. Out of pain and chaos and corruption, Washington was securely established as the capital of a lusty nation, and no one, looking on the public buildings, spoke of ruin of antiquity any longer. I think that Margaret Leach has a few ideas in mind for what those later calamities were. Of course, she was writing this before Watergate, much less before an armed insurrection to overthrow the Capitol, an armed insurrection in which someone carried the Confederate flag. Not the same someone who smeared feces on the walls, but someone equally contemptible. But she's right, of course. Not only in the fact that there have been times many times when this victorious city of Washington should hang its head in shame, but also in the fact that it would change. That old dog trot would go away. Now, it didn't go away completely. The hints of that old laconic, oh my God, it's hot Washington continued to crop up after the Civil War for the next 60 or 70 years. Fewer and fewer, fainter and fainter echoes, but they were there. They were there for a while. I believe they're completely gone now. I think that Washington, D.C. is pretty much a shark tank. I think you have to go out to the suburbs, the near beautiful suburbs, to get a feeling of what the old Washington itself used to be like. You'll still get the, oh my God, it's hot, but you'll also get a sense of the particular spell of that old city. But anyway, I could go on and on. I really want to recommend this book, of course, and I wanted to start BookTube at War on a strong note. I had a blast rereading this. I'm sorry that, you look at this and you think, that doesn't look so bad, but this would not survive another reading. Pages are already starting to sort of dislodge from the glue of the spine, so I have to just get rid of it, unfortunately. It'll be my fate to just keep rebuying Reveille in Washington, because I'm only ever going to find it in this version. These Time Life books are so weird in that way. They're so good, but you can't keep them. Anyway, that's my BookTube at War. That's how I'm starting off. I'm going to move on to something else tonight. Who knows? BookTube at War is only a month long. I might very well do a video every day. There's a free country, right? You can't stop me. Anyway, I'll wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.